First, we will have live interpretation, so please, if you need a translation, use your headsets and stay with channel 1 for English translation. Also, we will have an opportunity to interact with you today, of course, physically, after the initial remarks, but also on our app Slido, which you can see here on the screen as well. Please feel free to start asking questions right now, and we will be monitoring them during the discussion. President Đukanović is a very remarkable individual. For at least half of his life, he has held highest level positions in Montenegro. Since 1991, he has served as president, prime minister, or the chair of the ruling party. Under the president's watch, I think at that time in the function of prime minister, Montenegro negotiated NATO accession. His long career and his very rich experience in governing makes Mr. President an extraordinary partner for Europeans to discuss the past, the present, and of course the future, not only of Montenegro, but also of the entire region and of the entire European continent. Mr. President, we counted that you attended GLOBSEC Forum in Bratislava 5 times, and I think the intensity and frequency of these visits highlights the importance of relations between Montenegro and Slovakia, and of course the European Union. So thank you very much, Mr. President, for being with us, and we will start with your opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Hvala vam.
Very much. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to express gratitude and happiness that I'm here with you today. As I suppose you know, today and yesterday I have been in the official visit to Slovakia. We had excellent conversations yesterday and today, and the entire program wouldn't be complete, I would say, without this visit to GLOBSEC. As we could already hear, I have been a regular guest in GLOBSEC, and I do follow with pleasure how GLOBSEC has become increasingly relevant platform for discussion about all the significant global issues. That's why I have always been inspired to participate in this forum, and that's why I am inspired today to share with you a couple of thoughts related to the Western Balkans, Montenegro there, and our European future with you. I would like to thank the director for the introductory words, and I would like to thank you all for the attention that GLOBSEC is paying to the Western Balkans. And I would like also to thank you for the topic of today's discussion, which is very inspiring. I would like first of all to share with you a couple of thoughts, hoping that we would have enough time to enjoy the more interesting part of our conversation, where you will have questions and ask for certain explanations and give comments. So I would put all the efforts not to speak for too long in my introductory note, although I have to say that I haven't been very successful in that. So I would like to divide my presentation in 2 parts. One is related to Montenegro and the other to the region of the Western Balkans. In Montenegro, after 30 years of continuity of certain structures in power, we have had a change of structures in power. It happened in regular parliamentary elections at the end of August last year. But during those 30 years of the continuous rule of the Democratic Party of Socialists that I am the president of, that in the entire period was either a dominant part of the ruling coalition or was in power by itself. We did a huge amount of very important tasks for the future of Montenegro. I wouldn't like to dwell on it too much, but I think it's important to mention that in the 90s, Montenegro was the only former Yugoslav republic where there was no war. Regardless of the fact that we are a multi-ethnic state, and you know, the wars were between the ethnicities and between different confessions, that is a success of ours, that we managed to preserve peace, and on top of that, we accepted 120,000 of refugees at certain points. I mean, it is an amount of 10% of our population. I mean, if you can translate this to example of other countries with bigger populations, you will understand how huge burden it is for every economy, and let alone small Montenegrin economy that was surrounded by war and instability all around. So we think that it was a success that in such an atmosphere we preserved peace and stability and that we kept multi-ethnic harmony. And it's important that we at that time established the economic sustainability of Montenegro. During Yugoslav Federation, Montenegro was one of the least developed republics. And those underdeveloped republics had support in form of grants from the Yugoslav budget. In the war years, early 90s, we didn't really have an economic boom. At that time, however, Montenegro said, we don't want grants anymore. We want to live on our work and we want to be self-sustainable. So that is something that we preserved and that we kept. And at that time, it was the most dynamic development of our economy. And after that, we turned to restoration of our independence. You know, Montenegro is a very proud country with thousands of years of history. But unfortunately, at the beginning of the 20th century, when the first Yugoslavia was established, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, Montenegro's statehood was sacrificed. It didn't have to be done in that way. It made a lot of sense that Montenegro is an equal constituent of that kingdom, but it didn't happen. First of all, Serbia annexed Montenegro, and then they created the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. It was a trauma for Montenegro. Montenegro is very proud of its statehood, and it took us an entire century to get back to the situation to restore our independence. And that's what we did in a democratic referendum on the 21st of May 2006. Needless to say, there was a huge mistrust of Europe towards that idea, because Europe, unfortunately, recognizes the Balkans by instabilities that happen frequently in the Balkans, and almost no state was established in Balkans without a war. So it was a precedent that we did, and Slovak diplomats helped us a lot in that. Miroslav Lajčák and František Lipka were very much involved into the implementation of this referendum, and they were guarantors that the referendum would take place in line with the rules stipulated by the European Union. We adhered to the rules. They seemed to us unfair at that moment because they requested not 50% plus one for independence, but 55% plus one, which seemed to us to be unfair. But that was an investment into a new quality of trust from the European Union. So European Union recognized the results of the referendum, and they opened a door for progress of Montenegro towards EU membership. And after that, we had another successes. We joined NATO. We formalized our membership at the beginning of 2017. And in the meantime, we had very intensive negotiations with the European Union. So now we are the only aspiring country that has all negotiation chapters with the European Union open. So that was a reminiscence of what we have done in the period behind. But as I said, understandably, structures in power changed. Because it's logical, you know, that people get tired of one structure being in power all the time. Obviously, they develop curiosity of what others might offer. So now for a bit more than 10 months, we have experience of having new structures in power. We, who were at the head of the country before that, welcomed them with mistrust. And I will explain to you why. Because all the time in the last 30 years, they were against our statehood, our independence, they were against our membership in NATO, and they were against all the reforms that we implemented with a wish to join European Union. But a couple of days after they won in the elections, they signed an agreement where they actually committed and obliged that they would continue the same policy that would lead Montenegro closer to European membership. At that time, we decided to stop a little bit to give them a chance. There were many people in Montenegro and in Europe who were very suspicious about whether Montenegro would have capacity to have a peaceful or calm transition in power, of structures in power. But we dispersed those suspicions. We ensured smooth transition, and the government was constituted, and now they are working in the position of the executive branch of power. But 10 months after that, I have mixed feelings or mixed impressions. It seems to me that a part of that ruling coalition shows an inclination to adopt European values, and that they could become a part of a larger front of pro-European policy that would guarantee Montenegro to keep going in a stable and dynamic manner towards its European goal. But it seems to me that the largest part of that ruling coalition, or to be more precise, 2/3 of those structures, are still at the positions of greater Serbian nationalism and Russian geopolitical interest in the region of the Western Balkans. And they can't be successful in achieving those goals because, among other things, thanks to very responsible position of the current opposition in Montenegro. We said, okay, we lost power. We have just one seat in the parliament less, but we will be a very responsible opposition. We will support everything that the ruling structures do to take us closer to European Union. But on the other side, we will oppose very strongly if they try to revise our strategic goals. So now we are fighting in the political arena. And I want to share with you that I am an optimist. In the last 10 months, we could see that Montenegro has a serious capacity of pro-European policies, both in the opposition and among the ruling structures, and that guarantees that we will keep moving dynamically towards European goal. When it comes to the region, these two questions are, of course, very much interwoven. I would like to draw your attention to the following fact. Thanks to the slowing down of the enlargement policy by the European Union, European future of the Western Balkans has become blurred. As we know, in the time when Slovakia, together with other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, was getting closer and closer to its European goal after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had a war in the region of former Yugoslavia. And unfortunately, we lost that golden era of enlargement. And in the meantime, Europe got tired, as they say themselves. They got tired of the enlargement. So they are not talking anymore about enlargement fatigue, that's true, but certainly they are not undertaking the expected steps to ensure good dynamics of the implementation of the enlargement policy in the Western Balkans. And whenever the European perspective in the Western Balkans is blurred, then it's an excellent introduction for revival of retrograde policies and for attracting geopolitical interests of third countries. And their interests do not coincide with European and Euro-Atlantic interests, that's for sure. So that is what we have now. Unfortunately, because of the lack of attention from European Union, we are seeing the decline of the reform enthusiasm in the countries of the Western Balkans, in the governments and in the societies. And I will repeat, that is caused by the policy of the European Union. I mean, we can all remember what the first message was when Juncker became the president of the European Commission. He said immediately, no enlargement within our mandate. Can you imagine how inspiring that might be for countries in the Western Balkans? Because in Western Balkans, European values are not deeply rooted. We are yet to root them. We are yet to build them. We are yet to encourage the societies of Western Balkans to invest efforts to implement requiring reforms so that these societies can have European future. So when we got that, as a consequence, we now have to deal with the revival of retrograde and nationalistic policies in the region. So today, unfortunately, in the region, they are trying to bring back the nationalistic policies from early 90s. Those are the policies that actually question the ability of Western Balkans to cherish and to keep multi-ethnic democracy and harmony. I mean, you don't live in the Western Balkans, and people who know a bit about the region of the Western Balkans are aware that it is a kind of eternal dilemma for our region. It is opened over and over again. So, as an alternative to multi-ethnic harmony and democracy, there is the idea of reconfiguration of Western Balkans into three greater ethnically and religiously homogeneous countries: Greater Serbia, Greater Albania, Greater Croatia. So that was done in the 90s, that was offered in the 90s, but all these three greater state projects expectedly actually failed. And instead of those greater states, we got a greater tragedy. We got about 150,000 people who died in the wars in former Yugoslavia, which was a consequence of this illusion. But we hoped that after that and after the Dayton Agreement, these illusions were buried. But unfortunately, we see that immediately after the process of enlargement slowed down and the idea of our European future got blurred, we now have those people or actors with the retrograde ideas, homogenization, and again, mistrust, fundamental mistrust that Western Balkans can live as multi-ethnic democracy and harmony. And now, of course, as a consequence of that, we have the penetration of third parties. And I would say it's only logical. Europe is not the most important, and it's not the only geopolitical actor in the globe. But it is the most responsible, I would say, for European continent, including this little pocket of European continent which is called Western Balkans. And of course, if it's not active enough, we will have no vacuum. We will have something else. We will have somebody to fill in the empty space. So now we have various third parties, most active being Russia. Russia is very active. Russia has a very broad range of forms of presence in the Western Balkans, and it's been very successful, I would say, in defining the nodes that they would use as hubs for spreading their geopolitical interests in the area of the Western Balkans. But the key message that Russia wants to send to our countries is the following: don't integrate into NATO. Earlier, they were more tolerant towards the integration to the European Union, but it seems to me that now increasingly they demonstrate from Russia that they disagree with membership of Western Balkan countries in European Union. Unfortunately, they are trying to give us the illusion again in the Western Balkans that Western Balkans has an alternative, has another option, and that the European future is not the only alternative, not the only choice. But I believe it is the only option. Unfortunately, Balkan is very easy to manipulate with. And Russia knows that. They have experience in the Western Balkans. So I think we can't say that there is no risk of Balkan buying that story again and go back into the conflicts in the Western Balkans. I believe that the only healing response to that is a more aggressive policy of enlargement of the European Union to the Western Balkans. I believe that there is a large interest and significant interest of the countries of the Western Balkans to become members of the EU, but the interest of European Union to ensure that European values live in the Western Balkans is not smaller than that. I think that the messages that we hear now that European Union should be consolidated first and then focus on further enlargement, I think that such messages are risky. They don't seem too meaningful for me or rational. I do, of course, respect the problems that the European Union has, and I respect the caution that key member states show. But when it comes to this idea, I always have one picture in mind. I see Europe as our home, the home of all of us. Western Balkans is just one room in that big house. Of course, it's obvious that we all have problems in the entire house, and the idea is to solve the problems to keep stability, prestige, and global competitiveness of the European Union in a redesigned global architecture that is in making. But it seems to me to be very dangerous to neglect one room where people live for a long time without European rules. And there is a kind of fire there that is small now, but can really become big. We cannot afford that, because if we neglect it now, we will have to work on rehabilitation and solving the problems. And the European Union has already invested a lot of money and risked lives of their people in the military and civil missions in the region of the Western Balkans since the 90s. We don't need to repeat that, to repeat those mistakes. I think we should try to manage these processes in parallel, consolidation of European Union and creating conditions for enlargement of European Union by ensuring that European values are deeply rooted in the Western Balkans. Of course, it should be clear that nobody wants to have any shortcut to become a member of the European Union. I know that the European Union keeps emphasizing that they had an experience where they were a bit more flexible in one stage of accepting new members, and nobody requests for any shortcut. I think it would be wrong. I think we have to meet all the requirements. So, of course, we are aware of our deficiencies, starting with the deficiencies in the field of the rule of law, and we are willing to deal with those deficiencies. And, you know, I don't have to tell you, because you know, it was much easier to Slovakia and other countries that joined NATO and European Union in that wave when they had a strong and continuous and comprehensive support of the then European Union to meet the requirements as soon as possible and to become members of the European Union. For a long time, we haven't had such support from Europe. We can pretend not to see it. We can pretend that everything is okay, but it's not. And we know this very well. We were listening for a long time that there is enlargement fatigue, and now we hear different messages. New European Commission, through the President von der Leyen, sent excellent messages at the beginning of the work of the new Commission, but those messages were followed by other messages not less important from very important centers from European Union, and those messages were not so encouraging for enlargement policy and foreseeable European future for the countries of the Western Balkans. Of course, we all have the right to think differently, but we in Western Balkans do have the right not only to wish for European future, but also to say what we think about the enlargement policy. So our opinion is that it is impermissibly long and slow, and that this slowliness actually opens the door to infiltration and interference of malign policies that produce very serious consequences in the territory of the Western Balkans. We think that we should not allow that to continue. Western Balkans, as the entire European continent, is a primary responsibility of the European Union, and we should not allow anybody, because of their geopolitical interests, and particularly those who are contrary to European Union, to take place of the European Union. So these are two messages that I wanted to share with you in the beginning. I mean, there are many questions related to this and that I could discuss today, but I have tried to give you only the key messages to provoke you to ask questions, and I will be more than willing to answer all your questions. Thank you.
Mr. President, indeed a lot of food for thought and a lot of topics for conversation. I encourage the participants to start asking questions on Slido, but first I wanted to say that here in Slovakia, we're in a country that knows, sadly, by experience, what it is like to be at the center of geopolitics. So we will continue considering it our duty and responsibility to demonstrate solidarity with the countries to whom history was even less kind than to ourselves. So we were always glad to work with the countries in the Western Balkans and to support your aspirations. And the International Visegrad Fund, where we're working in all Western Balkans countries on supporting democratization and reconciliation. And we're happy to continue with that as well. But to start the conversation, I wanted to bring in another research that we are doing in the countries of the Western Balkans, including in Montenegro. And we'll do a little exercise with all the participants here. I would invite everybody to go on Slido now to the polls section. We do opinion polls in the Western Balkans, and Montenegro is one of the countries. And first, I would like to zoom in on the question that you already raised, and that's NATO. Maybe it's an easier part than European integration, but it's still an important part. So we're asking the participants the same question that we asked the people of the Western Balkans. And the question is, should Western Balkans countries stay in or join NATO? While people are answering the question on Slido, I will give you the taste of what we found out through opinion polls in the region. For example, in Montenegro, 45% of people say that they would prefer to stay in NATO. But 50% say that they would like to leave NATO. Of course, it differs from country to country, but this is what we observed in Montenegro. We see, of course, that here in Slovakia, everybody is saying that Western Balkans countries should be parts of NATO, which is, of course, an encouraging sign. Next question, please. The next question that we're asking concerns the following. Does NATO membership grant a safe environment for the Western Balkan countries? Again, a few statistics that we found in the polls. 47% of people in Montenegro say that yes, NATO is granting safe environments, and about 55% say no, it doesn't, which again demonstrates a split. And again, I'm glad to see that the participants in this room all not entirely unanimously, but overwhelmingly agree that NATO does provide a safer environment for the Western Balkans. And the third question concerns what you, Mr. President, already mentioned concerning the attempts of other countries, like, for example, Russia, to stir a little bit of different geopolitical feelings in the region. And the question is, does Russia deliberately provoke NATO by initiating conflicts in Eastern Europe? And again, the numbers for Montenegro, 44% say yes, and 60% say that no. And we see, of course, that our audience is a bit more unanimous in this regard and agrees with the fact that Russia does try to deliberately provoke conflict in the region. Mr. President, I would invite you to comment on these issues and explain to us a little bit what is the public attitude towards NATO and what are your expectations from also NATO members to help you with handling this situation at home.
Well, results of the poll do not surprise me. I want to tell you the following. Montenegro is one of the countries in the Western Balkans that, thanks to the fact that we were lagging behind for a long time in history and the fact that we were outside of the mainstream of the European policy for centuries, have become a society with a lot of skepticism about European values that we suggest as the leaders of the state policy. However, without compromises, paved the path of European Montenegro, and we have been successful in that, and I told you about some of those successes. You know, in 1999, we had a conflict with NATO. At that time, Montenegro was a constituent part of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, led by Slobodan Milošević. That war, and I used to say that at that time, and I want to say it now, was absolutely unnecessary. But Milošević wanted a conflict with NATO alliance to reinforce his position in the domestic public in Serbia. But if we had a poll before that war in Montenegro, I think that 70% of people would say in Montenegro that we should join the war against NATO. But we did not make the poll. We said it's not our war. We don't want to participate in that. We want to become members of NATO. What I want to tell you is that the state policy is not only to listen to the public opinion, but to try to change it. And I think we have managed to do that in Montenegro because we were brave in our vision. And why did I say that I was not surprised with these results? Well, first of all, there are two very significant prejudices that burden the public opinion in the Western Balkans. First of all is the Cold War division, something that we had as a consequence of the NATO alliance and the Warsaw Agreement. But additional prejudice comes from the conflict with NATO and airstrikes against Serbia and partly against Montenegro. That influences public opinion. And the third thing is something that we may not forget. The structures in power in Montenegro changed. And as I said, the policy that the politics that are in power now in Montenegro were against our independence, were against NATO alliance membership, and were against reforms that should lead us to European Union. So now, if you do a poll, people find it easier to say that they are against all these things, to get along and show agreement with the structures in power. But I don't think it's rational, and I don't think it's a sustainable political course in the long run. I'm absolutely sure that a stable and responsible opposition with some parts of the ruling structures already today, and particularly in foreseeable future, will represent and constitute a very good platform for further progress of Montenegro on the European path. So I do accept these results of the polls as something valid, but I do not think that it is something that is suggesting that there is a strategic turning point. And I will repeat, we did not organize a referendum for membership in NATO, and we did not organize a referendum on whether to accept and recognize the independence of Kosovo or not. We didn't do that. We made decisions, and after some turmoil in the beginning, those decisions were accepted. And I think that our policy would have been even more accepted and better if we had stronger acceptance and support of our Western partners. We have to understand that European values are not inherent in the Western Balkans. Unfortunately, Western Balkans has been for too long outside of the context of European values. And if we want to help European values to be rooted in the Western Balkans, then it's not enough that national governments put efforts. We need help from more powerful centers from Europe and from North Atlantic Alliance. And we did not get sufficient support. And that's why, again, today we have confusion, not only in Montenegro, but in the Western Balkans. But I would like to repeat, I think we can get out of that confusion if we altogether go back to our goal to make this part of European continent European.
A long list of questions that we received online, but I also want to invite the people in the audience to ask questions. And I see Mr. Ambassador wants to go first, so we can start with you. I will take a couple of questions in a row so that we can squeeze in more. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much indeed, President Đukanović, for talking to us very frankly and openly today. I'm Nigel Baker, the Ambassador of the United Kingdom. My question really is about your neighbour Serbia. I'd just be very interested in your view of the evolution of your relationship with Serbia at the moment and the evolution of your relationship with Serbia over the coming months. Obviously, clearly a very important element in Montenegro's work and development towards European Union and towards the Western structures. Thank you.
And I will add here similar questions that we received online, which also wants you to expand you on the Kosovo issue in your answer.
As for the politics of Serbia, I would recommend to you to analyze two dimensions. One is the attitude of Serbia towards Montenegro. That was in your question, Mr. Ambassador. And the second aspect is the role of Serbia in the region. When it comes to attitude and relations of Serbia towards Montenegro, unfortunately, it is a traditional attitude that has been in existence for centuries, where Serbia has never actually genuinely accepted Montenegrin independence. I can confirm that for the period in the last 30 years that I have been involved in policy, but it is a short period. I can go back even to the 19th century and to various documents that Serbia used to adopt at that time. And it's absolutely clear that they had aspirations, even at that time, that Montenegro is a part of a Serbian entity in culture, religion, and national ethnicity. But after we restored independence, the ruling structures or structures in power in Serbia changed many times, but we never saw the policy of true respect for Montenegrin independence, and we never saw the wish to build the best possible relations with Montenegro on equal level, as equals, yeah. I had a question from a journalist asking me to make a comparison with the relations between Czech Republic and Slovakia. And unfortunately, we cannot say that those relations are on that level of partnership and trust that you have with Czech Republic. The current president of Serbia several times spoke in public criticizing his predecessors because they allowed Montenegro to become independent. As if Montenegro had to ask them for any permission. We didn't ask anybody for permission. As you know, there is a formula of peaceful resolution of Yugoslavia. Unfortunately, it was not peaceful resolution, but Montenegro was a part of that formula, because Montenegro was one of the 6 equal republics. And the formula was that each republic that wants to restore its independence can do it within the existing borders. So Montenegro just used its right, and it didn't need any permission from Serbia. But I am talking about this because I want all of us to understand that Serbia has actually never accepted truly Montenegrin independence. And in every period of history, Serbia is watching Montenegro as a prey. And they are trying to make it a part of the imaginary Greater Serbia. Today they call it the Serbian world, which is a kind of copy of the Russian world as an idea which exists as a notion in former Soviet Union. This Serbian world should be one state with centers Banja Luka, Podgorica, and Belgrade. But when it comes to the role of Serbia in the region, and I think we should pay attention to that, I think that their role is potentially very destructive, because Serbia is now back to the politics from early 90s. And that is the following politics. Serbia is there to preserve and ensure exercise of interests of Serbs wherever they live in the region. That is the same mistake that Milosevic made in the 90s. At that time, Bosnian Serbs requested for protection from Serbia, and Milosevic got into the trap. And we know what happened later. We know what happened in Bosnia, and we know what happened in The Hague afterwards. Today, Serbs are very much alike to Radovan. So the Serbs that live in Montenegro are very much like Radovan Karadzic. Vucic took the role of trying to protect them in Montenegro because they requested for his protection, and Vucic is trying to explain that it is a legitimate right of Serbia. I mean, it can't be a legitimate right of any country to interfere into the sovereignty of the neighboring country, and that is a road to hell. I am very sorry that Serbia is making that mistake again, and I am afraid that it could be a very realistic potential for causing instability in the region. Serbia is doing it now, relying on Moscow. And it's not only one person who will tell you, but many people who are in relevant positions in Belgrade who will say to you, Serbia lost Kosovo when Russia was weak. And now, in their opinion, Russia is not weak anymore. So that means that this might be the time to restore Kosovo, to take it back. I think that idea is completely unrealistic. But the fact that they have this idea showed to me that they are again at a platform of establishment, or wish to establish a kind of enlarged state to the detriment of other countries in the Western Balkans. So they want to revive the policy that led to huge losses of lives in the 90s. That's what I think.
Please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question here. And since we have a question over there, please, Tomas Stražin.
Mr. President, thank you for your introduction and for this discussion. My question turns to Montenegro, and it's about Montenegro's role in the region. You elaborated a little bit about the role of your country in the region, but I would be interested in a more detailed view. It's the smallest country in the region. Some years ago, not so long time ago, it was considered to be the leader in integration processes, which perhaps is not the case nowadays. So is Montenegro going to occupy back the role of the leader in integration, or what should be the position of your country? How it is going to inspire other countries in the region, and so on and so forth. I would be really thankful if you could elaborate more on this. And as I see my question on the board, on the screen behind you, I would also be interested in your view. It concerns bilateral relations of Montenegro and Slovakia. I see Ambassador Gandel sitting with us here. So when would we see Montenegrin ambassador here in Bratislava and the embassy established here? Thank you.
Mr. President, and while you're answering the question about the reforms and being the leader in reforms in the process of EU accession, there is another related question, which is asking you to elaborate which reforms you think are the hardest to accomplish, and which reforms that are part of the EU accession you think Montenegro is struggling the most with.
I think that Montenegro has been and has remained the leader of in the reforms in the region. And I'm not saying this only because of the statistics, because we opened all the negotiation chapters and no other country has done that, but I think that throughout the entire period, we were very committed in promoting very sincerely European values in the region. you could hear me criticizing certain policies of European Union, but you could never hear me talking about alternatives, any alternatives. We think that there is no better future for the Western Balkans than membership in the European Union. And we think that only as a country getting closer to the European Union, we have the right to participate in the dialogue about what the European Union policies should look like. So even today we are ahead of other countries in the negotiation process, but the opinion that I said about the standstill in the reform efforts refers to everybody, and that includes Montenegro. So this standstill or this interruption is general, and I think the cause for that is the lack of a good impulse or good stimulation from the European Union. So I think that the structures of European Union should work a bit harder on better stimulations or impulse so that we can restore the vigor and work harder on the reforms and getting closer to European goals. And as for your question of what are the most difficult reforms to implement, I will say, and this will not surprise you, that those are the reforms in the field of the rule of law. You know that the European Commission actually configured their model of negotiation or reconfigured it at the beginning of negotiations with the countries of the Western Balkans. Probably the experience with Croatia, who was last to successfully finish the negotiations, led the European Union to choose to focus additionally on the importance of negotiations in chapters 23 and 24. So the entire negotiation process is conditioned now by the success achieved in those negotiation chapters. So I am sure that you will not be surprised when I say that we do have a deficiency of the rule of law in our region. And if I said completely openly that unfortunately all our societies for decades live outside of the mainstream of modern Europe, then it's only logical that as a consequence we have a deficiency of the rule of law. And this is even more true because in the meantime we had conflicts like the one in the 90s. And when you have conflicts, then you don't have rule of law. You have an anarchy. Everything goes wild. So we have to work hard on the establishment of the rule of law in Western Balkans, and we are working on that. And I am happy that I can share with you that the last non-paper and resolution of the European Parliament and Commission about the rule of law stated that we have made a progress in that respect. So I think that we are close now to meet a very small number of the remaining benchmarks, interim benchmarks in the chapters 23 and 24, and to turn them into closing benchmarks and to start more intensively closing the chapters, ensuring that Montenegro, with the support of the European Union, can again have a good pace of the negotiation process and that we continue dynamically towards our European goal. But in addition to the rule of law, I think that there are two more areas that are very demanding. One is definitely the environment. The field of environment was, the territory of Montenegro was under the effect of industrialization after the Second World War, and environment was not taken much into account, and we have consequences of that. In our constitution in the 90s, we wrote that we wanted to build Montenegro as an ecological state. Of course, it's the easiest to write it down. It's very important and not very easy to do things after you write it down. We have the credits of the World Bank, and we remove and rehabilitate one after another black spots in terms of environment. And we are creating preconditions for sustainable development of Montenegro in the future. And the third field is economy. I think that economy is a serious challenge for all of us. We need to create competitive economy to function in the open European market. So I think that these are the three key challenges when it comes to reforms in the Western Balkans. I think that I managed to answer the question, and the question of embassy. Yes. Well, we are trying to extend our diplomatic network continuously, but also to do that in such a way that it is sustainable, that we do not rush into it before we create a good economical basis to keep extending the diplomatic consular base, network. I want to tell you that we perceive Slovakia as a very close country, close to us. And I share that with people that I talked to in Bratislava. So we are not talking as partners in NATO or partners tomorrow in the European Union. No, we are talking to each other as friends. And I don't think that there is any other country, including our neighbors, that knows Montenegro so well as Slovakia knows us. So Bratislava is certainly one of our priorities. But for now, as I said, we have to be careful and prudent. And we go step by step because we don't want to get too large expenditures, because we need to create, first of all, the stable basis for our economy in order to be able to finance all of that.
A question from Mr. Ambassador. Go ahead, Mr. Ambassador, and Pavel Demes over there.
Yes, Mr. President, I'm the French ambassador here. Thank you very much for this clear message. I can confirm that from the viewpoint of Paris, Montenegro is a front runner of enlargement negotiation. As you said, you opened already all the chapters and you're very committed. So we also know that you are fully aligned on the CFSP, which is 100% alignment. This is really also a great signal of your commitment to Europe. I also would like to reassert that the EU is committed in the enlargement. My country is very much committed to that. I think my president met with the new authorities very recently, so we try to engage the dialogue with this new government. And we recently had the summit of Berlin, showing that we care, we are committed to improve the situation in the region from a political viewpoint, also from the viewpoint of the enlargement. My question are about two points. The first is about this new initiative related to the common regional market. How do you see the interest, perspective, input, contribution of this initiative? How do you see that? And second point is about the pandemic. We did not touch on that. Of course, it's a difficult situation for all of us. Maybe you could tell us how it impacts your country, maybe economically, socially, but also how the opinion is reacting to that, and if it has an impact on the relation between EU and your country and the region. EU, as you know, brought important support, 3 billion to support the country of the region in this difficult period, support in terms of vaccine also. Maybe we should do more. So on these two topics, the regional market and on COVID cooperation, how do you see it? And again, congratulations for Montenegro, still front runner for negotiation and for enlargement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. Pavel Demes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President, coming and talking to all of us. I have two questions. Upcoming, Slovenia assumed presidency, EU presidency as of July 1st. And I would like to ask what concretely you expect that Slovenia could achieve in coming 6 months, particularly since the Western Balkans was named as top priorities. Whether this is just sort of cliche, or you believe that Slovenes and EU during this presidency can achieve something measurable. And second question is, I know that traditionally church plays important role in public discourse in Western Balkan countries, Montenegro included, this complicated issue between Orthodox Montenegrin and Orthodox Serbian church. How satisfied you are with the role of church in your country in reconciliation and moving towards rule of law situation, what you highlighted is so important in the country?
Thank you so much for the question. And Mr. President, we're running a little bit late, so it's the last set of questions. And thank you for a few more minutes of your time.
Well, thank you for very inspiring questions. Mr. Ambassador, I think that every initiative for regional cooperation is very useful. And that's how we approach those regional initiatives. We have always seen and perceived regional cooperation as a field for preparing us to live in the European Union. And it's always been our imperative. I mean, if the regional initiative is designed as to make us closer to the European Union, then we are more than glad to participate. The initiative of common market is, I would say, a logical initiative to help all of us to prepare for life of our economies in the market of the United Europe and to prepare ourselves to get the competitiveness, which, as I said, is a challenge, and to promote what our investment potentials are, so that serious foreign investors choose to go into our region and to analyze the investment potential of the region as a whole. There were various ideas related to cooperation in the field of economy. We supported some of them, and for some of them we had certain reserves. I mean, we had reserves related to mini-Schengen initiative. The first question for us in relation to this initiative was if that was an alternative for our European future. We got the answer that it was not. Okay, then it was not. And we said we accepted it. But the second question that we had was, is there any overlapping? I mean, or are we investing double efforts or efforts on two sides? I mean, I had discussions about this with the officials in Berlin. They also thought that this initiative is well covered by the Berlin process, and that they thought that everything that the mini-Schengen can do can be done much better within the Berlin process. I mean, we currently have a whole pile of various regional initiatives, and I am afraid that frequently those initiatives actually served frequently to have meetings, but without clear effects. So I think that we should focus on what the most important needs are, and they are more or less similar for all the societies in the Western Balkans, and we should try to articulate them well through a good and successful regional cooperation. And the second thing, when it comes to COVID, we had various experiences. I mean, in the initial stage, Montenegro was the first country to become corona-free destination. And it was not falsified. We done it according to the strictest measures and criteria of the World Health Organization. And then, all of a sudden, we were at the top of the world list with the highest percentage of infected people and even a very high percentage of deaths. And we struggled a lot in that stage. But now we have a pandemic being under control. We now have in total 300 cases. And the number of newly infected among the domestic population is very small. So we could be optimistic, but unfortunately, we have to be very cautious. I mean, we keep reading, we get warnings from very relevant centers from the world. And those messages say that we might expect a new wave in the autumn. But we have used this time to open our borders and to try to use the tourism season. I think it's logical and expected from a country that bases its economy on tourism and services. So I would like to say that tourism season is going very well. It is not on the level of 2019, but it is very close to that level and significantly above what we did in 2020. I mean, on the other side, arrival of tourists increases the risk of infection, of course. But it remains to all of us to see what the final balance will be of this tourism season. The process of immunization is in progress. We had some problems with the COVAX program. It was late. And on the 4th of May, we got the first deliveries of vaccines, and we started the process of immunization. And currently, we have about 31.5% of the population revaccinated or fully immunized. Of course, that's not sufficient. But in a country with a total population of 650,000 people, this is not such a huge challenge. The percentage of vaccinated could have been higher if it weren't for certain reserve. I mean, many people already had corona, and they do have sufficient protection, or they think that they have sufficient protection with antibodies. And then, just like everywhere else in the world, there is a certain reserve towards vaccines. So it is now a serious task of the current government to work on popularization of vaccines, to continue with active process of immunization, because there is no doubt that it is the only way to reduce the risk of infections. As for Slovenia, Slovenia is a friend to all of us in the Western Balkans, and they know our problems and our needs really well. I really think that it's always a good situation when European Union is presided by somebody who knows us better and by somebody who is aware of this desperate need for all our societies to become members of the united European family. And that's my expectation from Slovenia, to make this question clear enough with their European partners. So these 6 months could be the time in which we could work fast on the new enlargement agenda, which could give a new dynamics or new pace to that process. And we should not forget, in parallel with that, we expect that in the autumn, the fund intended for the investment and economic development of the Western Balkans could be activated. It is a €9 billion fund. And each could really be a precious support to us, because on one side, we keep talking about a process of reforms and administrative harmonization of our systems with the system of the European Union. But on the other side, we have to work in parallel on the high-quality infrastructural connections of Western Balkans with European Union. Because, you know, today we have, you have a reserve towards European Union and NATO in the field of the Western Balkans, also because, and there is no doubt about this, majority of the population of Western Balkans, I'm not sure whether 50% or as high as 70% of people living there never visited any European country. But unfortunately, it's our reality. These are the people that still don't believe that it is a realistic future for them. So that's why I think that infrastructural connections, good roads that would make us closer to Europe, and the energy infrastructure and digital infrastructure, I think that these are the key projects that should help us to Europeanize or make the Western Balkans more European. So we will become members when we adopt sufficient standards to become members, but it does not mean that at the same time we should not work on infrastructural connections, because, you know, if we assume, for example, the worst scenario, Western Balkans never becoming a part of the European Union, but still, you know, European Union will be interested even at that time to see European values living in Western Balkans. I mean, they can live a stronger life if we have strong infrastructural connections of Western Balkans and European Union. As for the question of church, I could talk for a long time about the church, but I will try to put it in a nutshell. We have an experience in Montenegro. It was a very hot topic in our last elections. The intention of the state was definitely to regulate this issue, to adopt a new law on the freedom of religion, because we had one before. It was about 50 years old, and it was adopted in the time of communist Yugoslavia. But obviously, we opened that question in the period which was not good. It was on the eve of the elections, and the Serbian Orthodox Church put all the efforts into manipulating this issue in Montenegrin public and to present that issue as they wanted to present it, to use it as a tool for greater Serbian politics to come to power in Montenegro. And they did not fail, as we can see. But I think that regardless of the election results, this issue deserves serious attention. We have a very serious abnormality or deformity that the Serbian Orthodox Church became a political actor in Montenegro, that they have become holders of a very retrograde ideology. Serbian Orthodox Church. Yes, Serbian Orthodox Church. Unfortunately, I see there something that is very similar to clerical nationalism, even clerical fascism. And I have a very fresh memory from the 90s. Serbian church that came before the army. They went along the same path. First the church and then the army. And in the end, they were responsible, among other things, for the genocide in Srebrenica. I think that, unfortunately, the church is a dangerous weapon in the hands of the retrograde nationalism, and I think that we should focus political responsibility and attention on them if we want to remove the destructive forces dangerous for the peace and stability in the Western Balkans. And the church is at the same time closely related to, Serbian church is closely related to the Russian Orthodox Church, and we know to what extent Russian Orthodox Church is working for the Russian national interests. So I see all of this as a part of that big puzzle, which is undermining, in the essence, the European system of values and European societies.
You've already been very generous with us with your time. We really appreciate your time and your coming here. We haven't managed to ask many questions, but that probably means that you will need to come back to continue this conversation with us. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for being here with us.